Stephen, I have like a million questions to ask you about,
a million?
China, the economy, but
Okay.
let's start with the UK. How do you see everything going with Brexit?
Well, I like to adopt the theological option, which is praying for a decent outcome, because the way things are looking at the moment, it's all looking very, very tricky. Hopefully, there'll be a deal, but the question is whether a deal can satisfy both Brussels and the Conservative Party, and frankly also the UK Parliament. And it's unclear as to what that deal would look like that will keep all those parties happy. Now, to be fair, I think Theresa May is trying to argue to her cabinet that a sort of a hard Brexit, a cliff edge type of story, would be so unbelievably awful that they have a kind of collective responsibility to push something through.
Right. So will it be a fudge? And if it's a fudge, what does that actually mean for the people that voted Brexit?
Well, the fudge would be that we would be effectively leaving the EU. There may be some period where we stay in the EU in terms of accepting their rules, but no longer taking any control over those rules or having any kind of influence. There'll then be a hope of some kind of trade deal, which may be a Canada plus option or a Norway minus option, but something that gives the UK freedom to trade with Europe, but also importantly gives the UK some freedom in some areas to trade with the rest of the world. But one thing I note on this, which is that the EU itself is a difficult enough option, but for the UK to leave the EU and then to do a free trade agreement both with the US and China simultaneously, that I think is enormously tricky. So leaving the EU at this point in time is not necessarily the wisest decision because of the way in which the rest of the world is changing.
Right, but so what would you do? Is it a transition period that lasts 2 years? Is it a second referendum? What happens next?
Well, partly depends on the politics of how this progresses. So if there's a deal that's struck with Brussels that's unacceptable to Parliament or unacceptable to the UK cabinet, then Theresa May is in some degree of trouble. She'll either have to go back to Brussels and renegotiate yet another deal, or instead she'll have to have a position whereby she either has to call a general election or reluctantly would have to think about a second referendum. But the problem with the second referendum is that the opinion polls currently haven't really moved very much. There's lots of people who are uncertain, but of those who have made up their minds, the percentage in terms of remain and leave is actually very, very similar to what it was first time around.
Stephen, what's priced in pound right now?
Well, as far as the pound's concerned, I think nothing very much is priced in because the market is stuck between two different extremes. So one extreme is that there's a deal. The deal goes through that we have a safeguarded relationship with Europe, even though we're not actually in the EU. We're free to do trade deals with countries elsewhere in the world. At that point, the uncertainties about the cliff edge begin to go away. Sterling rallies strongly. So maybe up to 140, 145 against the dollar. If, on the other hand, there's a hard Brexit where everything falls apart completely, where there's a cliff edge story whereby there's tremendous uncertainty about Britain's relationship, not just with Europe, but also with the rest of the world, sterling goes all the way down to 110.
Wow.
So where we are currently, sort of 125, 130 or thereabouts, is a significantly long way away from where we probably will be once we know what's going to go on.
Okay, very quickly, if Jeremy Corbyn's Prime Minister, what happens to pound?
I think a lot of foreign exchange traders were feeling a little nervous if Mr. Corbyn came in, largely because people are uncertain as to precisely what his economic policies would be.
Yeah.
And bear in mind, I think that Corbyn and co. think themselves of having a kind of isolationist Britain, not so much in the conservative sense, but an isolationist Britain to allow them to build a socialist utopia.